All right. Hi all. I'm here today with Dale Allison. You're a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary, is that right?
Yes, I am. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Here in New Jersey.
Yes. Very, very prominent New Testament scholar. It's written a number of books, also some stuff in theology. I've been interested to talk to you partly because I feel like maybe we're both a little unusual in that I think we're both, broadly speaking, like liberal Protestants, but not. So I mean, you can tell me if you think this is fair or not, but I think a lot of liberal Protestantism is driven by a tendency to kind of, demythologize, naturalize, get rid of the spooky supernatural stuff. And that's very much not your tendency, and it's not mine either.
No, not at all.
Yeah, so I find you interesting as a theological thinker because I feel like we're both in sort of a kind of niche as compared to the broader range of thought. But we're here today specifically to talk about Encountering Mystery, your recent book on religious experience. As I say, you're mostly known as a New Testament scholar. You've also done some stuff on theology. What made you decide to write this book?
So I tell people this is actually the book I've always wanted to write, and that's true. My very first semester in college, so I was 17 years old, I took an intro to religion class, and the professor assigned William James's Varieties of Religious Experience. And I fell in love with the subject then, and I've tried to keep up in my own way since then. I have my own field of expertise, and keeping up with that is impossible. But nonetheless, I have tried. And I've also had my own experiences that some people would consider unusual. And I've reflected a lot on those over the years. I've also always sought parallels to whatever it is I've experienced so I can figure out how unusual I am or how typical I am, and so on. I actually did write a book that was largely about religious experience in the early 90s, but I was teaching as an adjunct. I was not a full-time professor. I did not have tenure. And I decided it was too dangerous because a search committee might think I'm too weird. So I actually never published this thing. And my children will find copies of it when I die. Okay, but those are the only copies that exist. But I did steal some paragraphs for this recent book. So part of this is that I'm old enough now and I have tenure and I'm not facing any more promotions. So the only thing they can do now to me is maybe demote me. I don't know, but I'm close enough to retirement that I can see it. And I've accomplished most of the things that I set out to accomplish in my own area. So I can now be honest, so to speak. This is the real me behind the scenes. And so it's time to do this. I also have sort of alternated over the years. I'll write a couple of technical books for academics in my field, and then I'll alternate them with a book on George Harrison or something else like that. But more specifically, I suppose, I teach at a seminary, and so I'm in contact with future pastors. I also have done a lot of lecturing in churches and so on. And I've discovered that a lot of the stuff I think I know about religious experience is unknown to lots of pastors and lots of people in the churches. I think it's unusual and strange. I don't know why this is the case. So a lot of this book is just reporting. I'm saying, look at all these things that are out there. Look at things people have learned. And I'm just, in part of this, I'm a journalist, right? And then beyond being a journalist, I'm also trying to encourage people to be pastoral about these things, because too many people, and this is one of the major discoveries of working on a subject like this, too many people who have unusual experiences don't know what to do with them, and they feel inhibited or shamed, and they can't share them with other people. And pastors are often part of that problem, and people in the church are often part of that problem. So a large part of this book is to say, look at all these experiences. They are hardly confined to people in mental institutions. Actually, most of the people who have the things, have experiences of the sort I write about, are ordinary, normal people. And there's nothing wrong with them or with us. Also, I suppose at a couple of points, this book aims at a little bit of pushback against a sort of reductionistic, materialistic point of view. It's obvious that I'm not what William James called a reductionistic materialist. And there are a couple of points where I say, well, you know what, if this is true, maybe it does point beyond something more. But I'm not here to prove anything. And this isn't strong apologetics in the normal sense, like I'm trying to prove something about God or the nature of the world. I'm really just saying, if you want to understand the world, look at the things that go on. And here are some of the things that you probably don't know are going on a lot. Mm-hmm. And then let's just think about them. So that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I guess as a philosopher, the question of how do we interpret them? Are they evidence for some view about reality? That's really what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
But I guess first we should get clear on like what exactly are they? What are we talking about? So
that's
what are some of the main, I don't know, findings of the book, or the main types of experiences that you find are common? Or
okay, so I have one chapter in the book which pairs two sorts of very different experiences. So it turns out that very common in the modern Western world are these encounters with what the people who have them end up calling love. Now, if a Christian has this experience, a Christian may well say, well, God is love. So they have a place to put this. But Sufis have had this experience, and secular people have had this experience. And at least when the speakers are English, the word that they will use is love. And to generalize, just out of the blue, more often than you would think, people feel overwhelmed by a sense of some invisible, loving force. It can be so powerful as to change their lives or even mark a conversion of sorts. And again, you can interpret this in Christian terms, but just looking at it phenomenologically, it's simply a sense that you are enveloped by by love somehow, right? I should add that having said all those things, almost everybody who has this experience at some point says, well, it was kind of like this, or I can't put it into words, it was ineffable, and so on. So you always have to have that qualification. So that's one sort of experience, and that experience kind of makes me happy, right? I like it. It fits my Christian theistic worldview. But one of the really interesting things is that in the modern world, lots and lots of people have these experiences in which they encounter the opposite of what I just said, and they will feel enveloped or surrounded by some sort of invisible, malicious, terrible, evil, oppressive something. Now, once in a while, somebody will say Satan, but most of the time they just use the word evil. And one of the interesting things, if you look into the literature, we now know enough about this from the psychologists and social psychologists and medical people. We know that at least one in 5 individuals in North America and in Great Britain have this sort of experience during their lives. I've had it twice. The second one was truly petrifying. And I did it myself, even though I'm from a Christian background. I didn't think Satan, but I was petrified, and it felt like a real something. And it was so horrible that the place I was sleeping in, right, I never went back there again. I really didn't. So those are two sorts of experiences. I play them off as antithetical in the book. But one of the things I want to emphasize is that these are not experiences that characterize Christians particularly, or even religious people particularly. And, you know, if you're an atheist and have one of these experiences, you can, you know, do your best to understand it in terms of chemicals or whatever, you know, your worldview would encourage you to do. But subjectively, these experiences are really powerful and really overwhelming, and they turn out to be pretty common, okay? So that's one thing I do in the book. I also have 2 chapters on things surrounding death, and one of those is fairly conventional because I'm trying to talk there about near-death experiences and asking questions about those. And whereas 50 years ago, nobody knew what those were, today, everybody knows what they, you know, what a near-death experience is. All you have to do is click on your TV, you know, and at some point you'll see some show on, you know, people who come back from the dead and so on. Just as interesting to me was the discovery that visionary experiences at bedsides are more common than I realized, even though I've written about visions before. And there is a lot of study of this now, but it turns out that it's really common for people who are dying to see usually one of 2 things, either dead relatives, right? Or illuminated humanoid figures, which in our culture get called angels. In other places, they will get other names, right? And there's been a lot of work with hospice people investigating these things lately. And two of the really interesting things are the people who have these, the statistic I came up with reading several studies was 99% of them don't think they're hallucinating. So that's interesting. It doesn't prove they're not, but it is at least interesting. And then in a couple of studies, I also ran into these stray comments about how caregivers or attending medical personnel would also see these sometimes. Now, they weren't filled out. I don't know how you would fill them out, you know, but that's really surprising and really strange.
Yeah, if multiple people see them, then that.
Yeah, that's really weird, right? Yeah. And I did include a couple of stories about multiple people supposedly reporting the same thing at a deathbed. One of the things we now know about, and I spent a little time on in this book, is something called terminal lucidity. And it's very rare, but it's now been documented enough that scientists, right, are studying it. And terminal lucidity is this really weird phenomenon where somebody has been out of it or comatose or suffering from Alzheimer's for weeks or months or even years. They've not been able to communicate. They're just not there to all appearances. And then very shortly before death, they become lucid and they have conversations and they return to normal. And a few of these have been cases where the brain has been seriously messed up or eaten by cancer or something like that. So it is a very, very strange phenomenon, not necessarily theistic at all, but the people who experience this are overwhelmed. And in our culture, most of them think it has something to do with God, right? Because that's just what you do when something inexplicable happens. The strangest thing that I talk about in the book, and I state quite clearly that this will pass the boggle threshold of many readers or most readers, but there are lots of reports of people who, as they are dying, give off a light. And I cited one instance where over half a dozen people were around a bedside and they see a light, and they're not morons. They actually open the curtain and investigate and study the mirrors and try to figure out what the heck is going on here, right? This is actually a motif that you can find in Christian hagiography. Sometimes when saints die, they sort of glow or light up. In our own time and place. Now, you're much younger than I am, so the Beatles may not mean anything to you, but I wrote a book on one of the Beatles, George Harrison, who passed in 2001, and his wife has claimed that when he died, he glowed and he lit up the room. Okay, now, I don't have any interpretation of this at all. I don't associate it with God or my religious faith, but I've seen it enough to know that it sometimes happens. Actually, what I discovered is that before everybody died in the hospital, when people were still dying at home, right, that this was an attested phenomenon, and people in the 19th century wrote about it. And you're interested in animal ethics. I read a book in which a scientist said, well, I can explain this. It must be that when people are dying, sometimes they give off phosphorus. So he took a hypodermic needle and he injected it into a dog and filled him with phosphorus, and the dog glowed. And he said, okay, now we've explained away this thing. Well, of course, the dog died 5 minutes later, and it's really horrible. But the interesting thing is that this was enough of a story that some scientist felt he had to explain it away. Okay. So again, I have no interpretation. And of course, it may be that everybody's lying. But the thing is that once you read enough stories reporting the same thing and they don't seem to be connected, then you can ask, is there a real human phenomenon here? Right. That's actually the way I proceed throughout the book. I never stop. I don't think I ever stop and say, okay, I know this story happened. What I say is, look, I find the same sort of story cross-temporally and cross-culturally. So I think there may be a real phenomenon here. And if it is, what might we think about it, right?
Right. That at least suggests that it's not that the story has gotten jumbled or somebody made it up or something, because a lot of different people in different contexts are reporting the same thing.
Yeah, that's right. I guess there are a couple of other things I might share about what I think the book does. So there's a chapter on prayer, and it looks at a number of aspects on prayer. But the thing that interests me the most is this. I have discovered that, at least in my time and place, which means right now North America, and from informal quizzing of people, being annoying and asking them to tell me, what are you doing when you pray for other people? That is, what is going on internally when you are engaged in what we call intercessory prayer? And what I have discovered is that our landscapes, our inner landscapes, are very different, and that we do very different things. And I've decided it's because most of the people that I've met anyway were told at some point that they should pray. Maybe their parents told them to pray, or a Sunday school teacher said pray, but nobody actually ever gave them the details. And so if you pursue this, and I couldn't find any psychologists who had. I couldn't find anyone who'd done this. And ask questions such as, well, do you see faces or do you see names? Do you see bodies? Do you see headshots? Do you see God? I mean, is your mind's eye looking at the deity, or is it looking at the people you are praying to? And what are you doing? What kind of things are you doing? Do you do something with your hands and so on? And what I discovered is that people are all over the place. That I found one person who prays to the letters G-O-D. I found a woman who prayed to her grandfather on her throne her whole life long. I found other people who say, no, you don't see God. God's behind you, looking over your shoulder, and you envisage, But when you envisage people, you get all sorts of different answers as to what that is. Sometimes it's a full body. Most of the time it's a headshot, like a high school yearbook. Sometimes if it's a full body, there's a little film, and for 5 seconds, the people kind of move around. Yeah, it's just really interesting to see the way people use their imaginations. Some do this geographically. They'll pray for people in place A, then place B, then place C. One woman told me she flies around, so she sees everything from above. The strangest response I ever got was from a seminary student who told me that when he prays, he plays the game of Tetris in his head. I don't know if you know Tetris, but it's that game where these colored tiles come down and you have to fit them into the slots before they hit the bottom. And somehow the shapes represented people he was praying for, and he prayed for them by putting them in the slots. That's really interesting. It's really interesting. I've also found some younger people who use the word scroll now when they talk about prayer, which means that technology is influencing what they are doing, right? Also, some people see words, but if you're illiterate, you're not going to see words, you're going to see something else. So the point here was just the great, stupendous variety. When we say people pray or they pray for others, I actually think that's not a single thing. It's all sorts of really interesting, imaginative things. So that's one of the things that I think the book discovers, or at least presents for future investigation, right? Mm-hmm. And then just one more thing about the book. This is really, really important to me. It came up earlier, but in both the secular culture and in the churches, even though things are better than they used to be, there is a lot of self-censorship. And important things happen to people that don't get discussed. Once people realize that I'm open-minded, I get stories, and they are often prefaced by, well, I've told very few people, or I've told no one, or I've just told my husband, that sort of thing. I also found a woman who had a near-death experience when she was very young and didn't tell anyone till she was in her 90s because she just was worried that they would think she was nuts. I found a book in which a woman who was a Jungian psychologist had this incredible encounter with this luminous figure of light that radiated love. Well, she was attending a Unitarian church, and she was a Jungian, and she didn't know what to do with it. So she talked to her teacher, and he said, you can't trust this experience. Don't pay any attention. And her pastor was very embarrassed and said something about menopause. Okay. And that was the end of her sharing her experience. It was the most important thing that ever happened to her. It shaped how she thought about the world, but her story never went any further until she was older and she was sick and she thought she might die. She was going to go under the knife. And so she decided to write a memoir of her life for her children. And then this story pops up. So she's carrying this around, right? She's carrying this around her whole life. The most important thing that ever happened to her. I think that means we live in a dishonest society. You should be able to share things like this with people without them being condescending or dismissive or something. At the very least, common courtesy says you say, well, that's interesting, and mean it, right? But you see this again and again and again. There's also a very famous story by a woman who had this mystical, overwhelming experience when she was a teenager with this beautiful, violent, fiery, transcendent force, right? But she was an atheist, and she was actually a well-known atheist. And she didn't tell this story until about 10 years ago. I think this happened in 1959. So she's a prominent atheist. She waits over 50 years to share her story with anyone because she realizes it doesn't fit. So finally she says, what the heck? I don't care anymore. I'm old enough, and this is what happened. So it's really interesting. The book is called A Wild God, and it's really interesting to see an atheist who's had a profound some kind of mystical experience, and a book trying to figure out what this was. And she doesn't say it was God, but it's kind of like, it must be some kind of a thing like a deity. Right? And it's also fascinating because she's had her whole life to think about this, and she's had every opportunity to dismiss it. I hallucinated, or I had a psychotic break or something. But she says, no, I think it really happened and I can't get away from it. And it really matters. So I think that's a sad part about our society. And here, the churches aren't, or many churches, I should say, certainly my last 2 or 3 churches, middle of the road liberal Presbyterian churches, there's not really a space for sharing these kinds of things. And I think that what happens is, or I know these experiences just get kept or they go underground. And that's one reason why people get surprised when they read the literature and discover how common some of these things are, because we don't talk about them.
Right. Yeah. So I guess turning to sort of this question of how do we interpret these things, like what do we think is going on? This is a little bit of a broad question, but like maybe you could give us a sense of kind of what your religious worldview is, and then how does it relate to these experiences, both in the sense of like, is the worldview, partly based on these experiences, and also like, how do you fit them in? What do you think is happening in these cases? Are people genuinely experiencing angels or?
Yeah. Okay. So, you mentioned angels. I do have a chapter on angels, but I intended it to be the most skeptical of the chapters.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of nonsense or maybe that's not the right word, but angel has become a sort of grab bag, and you just throw all sorts of different experiences in it, and then people publish them in books uncritically. So I'm a theist. I am a Christian, but I'm a Christian who holds all his beliefs lightly, and I am full of questions. And that's because, in part, I take seriously the fact that I am an animal and that I have a mammalian brain. And I've looked at other mammals and I've decided they can't figure out what's going on in the world. That is, their minds were evolved to take care of business pretty much around them and the business that comes to them through their ordinary senses. And although I spent my life thinking, and while I admire philosophers such as yourself, and while I live next to or a couple of blocks from the Institute for Advanced Study, I'm glad these really brilliant folk are over there trying to think and figure things out. At the end of the day, I think we're not that much different than dogs. So I don't really expect to put everything together or have a complete picture. It's kind of like I have a snapshot of a bunch of different things, but most of the picture is blank or it has question marks. So I profoundly hope and believe that there is a transcendent loving spirit. We call that God. But there are all sorts of reasons to have questions about that or to wonder about that. So that's the first thing, Christian theist. The second thing is I really think that people who think they figured everything out just can't be right. Right? And by the way, if you put all the people who could figure everything out right into a room, you'd say they disagreed on just about everything, right? Or if you took, I don't know how you'd pick them, but just take the 10 brightest people who ever lived and put them in the same room and ask, what do they agree on? You stick Aristotle in there and I don't know, Einstein and Augustine. You just stick all these people together and say, what do they agree on? And the answer probably is very little, except that it's important to think about these things. And if they don't agree on much, I really need to be modest and humble in my own, sincerely modest and humble in my own conclusions. which is one of the reasons why doing podcasts makes me feel a little uneasy, because people ask me questions and then I answer as though I'm supposed to know the answers and that I'm authority. But, everything that I think is qualified by a question mark. Some are big question marks, some are small, but there are always question marks surrounding everything. The third thing, since you asked, is that I am what is called a Fordian. Now, there was a man named Charles Fort who lived in the first half of the 20th century. He was a very strange person. He spent his life in libraries. And what he did is he just collected things that didn't fit. And he did most of his work through mainstream journals and scientific magazines. And he would just read them. And when something just didn't quite fit, so long time before UFOs, if there were reports of lights in the sky that people didn't understand, he would write them down, right? Or he noted that in the magazines, occasionally people would report that fish fell from the sky. Now, by the way, this does happen in a few places a couple times a year. It really does. People have different explanations for it. Do whirlwinds somehow pick up fish and then sort them into, varieties so that all the perch fall over here? Anyway, what he did is he just collected all these things, all right? And then he would publish books. His first book was called The Book of the Damned. And these were the facts that were damned by the science of his day, right? So I think that people sometimes see the future. I think sometimes they know what's going on in other places through means that we don't understand. I think sometimes there is this thing we call telepathy. I think sometimes when people say a miracle happened, something did happen that we can't quite explain. So I actually think the world is a weird place. It's not neat. It doesn't fit all our categories. And by the way, that includes my Christian categories, right? And one of the things that I don't like is that Christians often move too quickly from the unexplained to God, right? Mm-hmm. And the medieval Christians had something that they called, or they had a distinction between miracle and wonder. So a miracle was something they couldn't explain and God caused it. A wonder was something they couldn't explain and they didn't know what or who caused it, right? So I think the category of wonder is a big category. And I have a bizarre example in the book, which I won't repeat here. I would encourage anyone who's listening, go out and read it. But I did once experience a truly baffling, impossible event. And once you see the impossible in your own life, then you have to be open-minded about it occurring elsewhere. So I guess that's part of who I am, right? I'm a Christian, I'm a theist. I think my thoughts are very bounded. And I also think the world is a truly strange and weird place. And I don't like people who are smug in thinking that they've got it figured out. As to your other question, how does this fit? Well, some of the things in the book fit. So Christians in their scripture are taught God is love. So if somebody is overwhelmed by this invisible force that feels loving, then you could say, well, that's consistent with this belief, right? Or I suppose if you were inclined to this, I have lots of qualifications here. But if you wanted to say Christians believe in Satan or a devil or evil spirits, you could say, well, people sometimes run into these. This is not an irrational thing. Or you could say Christians believe in life after death, and maybe there are some elements in some near-death experiences that raise the possibility of something more than this life. We don't just, the candle isn't just blown out and that's the end of it. But one of the things I've done in this book is I've tried to be honest, and this is not a book of Christian theology or Christian experiences. As the title says, it's a book of religious experiences. Since it's based primarily on contemporary Western experiences, that means many of them are Christian. But there are times where I'll stop and say, okay, here's a report from a Zen Buddhist. How does this fit? Or here's a report from a Sufi. How does this fit? Or here's a report from an atheist. How does this fit? So this isn't Christian apologetics. It's really something like, this sounds preposterous, but I really was in some ways thinking of William James as I was writing this book. And I was trying not to be doctrinaire or narrow, but to throw, to throw a wide net of attention out there and pull in all sorts of different things. So the short answer then is some of these things are consistent with Christian doctrine. Others have nothing to do with Christian doctrine, at least as far as I can see. And some of them might be puzzling for Christian doctrine. So when a Christian has a negative near-death experience, and there are such things, most of them are positive, but once in a while, you'll get something that's truly hellish. And once in a while, this is a person who's, not Joseph Stalin and, thinks I'm a Christian. What the heck do you do with that? They're actually, if you sort near-death experiences into good and bad, unfortunately, it doesn't map out as, well, the good people had the good experiences and the bad ones had the bad. It just doesn't work that way. So if you're inclined to think that Christian doctrine demands some sort of instant sorting, the second your heart quits beating, then this isn't going to be good for you. You're going to be troubled by it. All right.
Right.
So some fits, some may not, and others just aren't to the point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess maybe the answer to the general worldview question, maybe we could summarize as like, it does have certain elements, but there's also a lot of things that maybe you don't feel like we can systematize. They might, things that they might suggest that say, certain paradigms are false because they can't account for certain things, but we don't quite know how to fit everything together. And we have just kind of maybe suggestive or,
Yeah, that is correct. So there is some, what you would call pushback at a couple of points. So there are, and I refer to a number in the book, there are people who say, and some of these appear to be documented, that multiple people saw the same vision, all right? Mm-hmm. So, the normal understanding of hallucination, which we like to throw at everything. I mean, everything's a hallucination that doesn't fit, and that way we explain it away. But our usual concept, derogatory concept of hallucination, has no space for more than one person at the same time seeing something. Actually, that's one of the arguments you'll know that Christians use for the resurrection of Jesus. Mm-hmm. They'll say, well, some of these appearances seem to involve more than one person. And if so, then isn't that suggestive? Okay, so the logic is sound, all right? And there are cases, there are in the book, of people reporting such things. So that raises questions. The second point, or second element of the book, would have to do with near-death experiences. So when you're out of it on an operating table and somebody is looking at you, nothing's going on, right? You just have an oxygen mask on and you're not there. And then if you wake up and tell this story, well, it's purely subjective because, it's just in your head, right? Mm-hmm. But the neat thing, or the provocative thing, is that we now have lots, and they number in the hundreds, at least the reports do, of medical personnel who were on the scene when somebody woke up and shared things, somebody who was near death, out of it, who shared some fact or observation that person should not have known. Now, if you have one story like that, Yeah, I suppose you could dismiss it if you have to, but at what point do you say there's actually something interesting? If the doctors are truly puzzled, genuinely puzzled, you could not have known that because you were full of sodium pentothal or whatever. There's actually a whole book which collects these now. It's called The Self Does Not Die. It's really interesting. And all it does is collect near-death reports that reportedly have confirmation from a medical attendant, a surgeon or a doctor or a nurse, that sort of thing. And the authors of this book interviewed people, and here it is. So it's possible that the authors of this book just made it all up, but there are too many independent reports from medical people that we have in the first person who have said, I can't figure this out. It makes no sense. I don't understand it. So I think there is evidence that sometimes people within so-called near-death experiences have veridical perceptions. Now, it makes no sense. How do you see things without your eyes? That just makes no sense. And you actually understand people who say that can't be. It's just impossible. All right. But I think impossible things happen sometimes. And so I have no explanation. It doesn't make sense. But a fact is a fact, even if you can't explain it. So I'm willing at this point to say that some of these people have veridical perceptions, and that tells me that something more than just the mundane is going on. That doesn't tell me there's a God or there's a being of light at the end of a tunnel or we're all going to be judged according to our works. It doesn't say anything like that. It just says, if I were a reductionistic materialist, I don't know what I would do. Okay? Other than just, it couldn't happen, right? So again, maybe I'm wrong, but that's how I am currently reading the evidence. And if so, this is really interesting. It's really revolutionary within the context of materialistic science, if some of these stories are true.
Yeah. Yeah. So when it comes to the question of, a reductionist materialist will think these are produced by some natural process, maybe the feeling of love is just some psychological, emotional experience and so forth. You're thinking, at least in these cases where multiple people see the same thing, that's hard to explain because, of course, if you and I both see something that suggests like an external cause, because why would both of our brains independently manufacture the same thing? And in these near-death cases, where people seem to have information that it doesn't seem like they could have gotten through mundane means because they were out of it and this was something in another room and whatever, that's hard to explain in those terms. Are there other I don't know, particular experiences
I think that's pretty much it. So the problem is when you have a profound religious experience, almost always you are alone. And almost always, if somebody were in the room with you, that person would see nothing, right? Absolutely nothing. So I have a foundational religious experience, a very mystical experience. I'm sure if somebody had been watching me, they would have just seen somebody sitting at just sitting in a chair. Nothing would have happened. So I don't know how you do I don't know how you get beyond that, except by observing that there do seem to be cases where there is something more than just, inside your head stuff going on. But I should add this, that many of these experiences do come with a testimony that this was real, or I wasn't hallucinating, or this was more real than real, that kind of thing. Now, unfortunately, last time I checked, I discovered that the neuroscientists think that there's some sort of circuit or chemical that can make you feel that the things are more real than real, right? So you can throw that away. But, just because there's a virtual reality doesn't mean there isn't a real reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can mimic all sorts of things by sticking electrodes in your heads and passing magnetic currents through them and so on. So the people themselves are often convinced. It doesn't help you, and it doesn't help the skeptic, but it is interesting anyway to run into people who will just say, I'm sorry, you can debate this, but I was there, right? Mm. So I have heard near-death experiencers just say, the people who doubt us don't know what they're talking about because I was there. Now, I haven't had a near-death experience, so I can't talk like that. But it does seem to me a little condescending just to look at all these people and say, I know they're just deluded. Maybe the thing to do would be to say, well, I don't want to think they're correct, and I have an explanation for it, but they could possibly be right, and maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah. There's this view in epistemology called phenomenal conservatism that says, it's been defended by people like Michael Huemer, that says, like, really, the foundation of any kind of justified belief is just how things seem to you. The reasons for belief are always, things seem a certain way. You prima facie have a reason to believe something if they seem that way. You can have reasons to think, oh, they can't really be that way, or something funny is going on, and that might defeat your justification. But yeah, I guess it might be that that something really seems to be the case to somebody, that at least initially makes it justified for them to believe that it is. And then we get into the question of, is this just too extraordinary to be true? Or, do you have some reason to think something funny is happening with your brain that misfired? And
so what's going to happen is if I have this experience and I know it happened, the question is, does my belief actually contradict things we otherwise know? Right. So that it could not be true, right? Now, I don't think we're actually there for most of these experiences. I don't think we know, even though some people think we do. I don't think we are in a place to say, I know that when people have near-death experiences, it's nothing but chemicals and electricity. I don't think we're in that position. So I think the testimony is to be objectively considered, if you will.
Yeah. And I guess it will depend partly, like when it comes to, say, alien abduction stories, I haven't looked a lot into those. I guess I don't believe them just because I think otherwise it seems unlikely that aliens are flying around and this is what they're doing. And so maybe somebody who, otherwise is strongly committed to sort of a reductionist picture might think, well, there has to be, some natural cause, and this can't really be theoretical. But if you're not otherwise committed, maybe you would think, well, we should, at least be open-minded about it, figure that,
So, I can't tell you anything about alien abductions. I can tell you about some related phenomena, but, the one that I use with my students is Bigfoot. And I tell them, go spend an hour on YouTube looking at firsthand testimonies to people who have seen Bigfoot. And they're very persuasive and very convincing, but I don't believe them. And I don't believe them because there are actually so many of them. If there were this many sightings of Bigfoot, there would have to be in a museum somewhere, a skeleton, or, somebody would have dug up a few bones at some point. They wouldn't all just disappear and be gnawed out of existence by rats or whatever. There are too many. And so I don't think most of these people are hoaxers or lying. I think most of them have seen something and misinterpreted it. That is, we have the Bigfoot myth, so it's in their head, and then they see something and they project that onto what they're seeing. Okay, now I may be wrong, and I'd be delighted for them to discover, a new hominid next week, where you live, right? Most of the Bigfoot reports are around you, up there in the Northwest.
I haven't seen any yet, but
when I talk, when I see people who are convinced, in this case, I just say, I don't think so. But I'm not dogmatic. If they found Bigfoot next week and paraded him, down the street and, all the news people were there and took pictures, I'd say, well, I was wrong, and this is really neat, right? But I doubt it. I doubt it. So,
Yeah.
you know, so with alien abductions, it might be, you know, I don't know exactly what it is. Maybe it involves sleep paralysis and some of these other things that we do know about. And maybe people's interpretations are now influenced by TVs and sci-fi movies, and who knows? I don't know. I shouldn't be talking about this. All right. So I'll stop.
Okay. So I guess thinking about these things like from within a Christian framework, there's this question about like the fact that these experiences happen in all sorts of different religious traditions and people interpret them in different ways. And this, I guess this also comes up in your resurrection book a little bit when you're talking about rainbow bodies, questions about religious pluralism. And I take it you're drawn to some sort of broadly pluralist position.
Yes, I am.
That can mean a lot of different things, I guess.
Yeah.
Can you say more? Can you say more about that?
Oh, well, I suppose the way to put it, or to speak of this within the Christian tradition, would be to say that I have something like Justin Martyr's Logos Christology. So I don't believe that the activity of God or that the divine that was manifested in Christ is somehow confined to my religion or to people who think like me. And for me, part of this conviction just comes from talking to people and meeting people outside my, you know, circle of religion and circle of affectivity and so on. I just don't understand anything else. So my way of thinking about this moves in a pluralistic direction. But there are a couple of places in the book where I do get into the relativity of perception. And I do think it's at points really important. So you know that the brain scientists and the neuro experts and the people who spend their lives studying perception, they now tell us that we don't perceive the world directly and that we fill in the blanks. And they even say things like our brains are creating somehow virtual realities within our head. And some of them will even say we're guessing based on past experience and so on. So this is as counterintuitive as it seems, a lot of these people, and by the way, I've never understood it. I'm some sort of realist, but I don't know how to put it all together, okay? They're telling me that I've got a theater in my head and I'm actually manufacturing it out of chemicals and so on. I'm not directly perceiving. Well, if you look at near-death experiences, there are a couple of dimensions of them that are really intriguing from this point of view. So people go down a tunnel of light and they'll often report a figure at the end. And if you read the accounts, some people say God, and others say Jesus, and some will say an angel, and some will say a being of light, right? Or some will say an illuminous, loving force. And people from non-Christian religions will use expressions from their religion. I really think that if something is going on here, that they are using language and concepts for the same thing. And they're translating what they see into their own concepts. And what is happening isn't mundane and doesn't involve ordinary sense perception. And if in this world, it seems to be in this world where our brains were evolved to function and to eat and reproduce and all that, if in this world we're making guesses and we're filling in blanks and we're projecting, it must be even worse for this other thing. And whatever is going on, then when we come back, we're still stuck with these brains and the categories they have and so on. So the being of light at the end of the tunnel really interests me. What the heck? Is this a single thing that we name differently, right? I think that's a possibility. The other aspect to near-death experiences that are really helpful in this connection, to me anyway, are the reports of return. Now, most reports are just fragmented. They just remember one or two things. But many of these people will say, I was at a doorway and I knew that if I went one way, I would die. If I went the other way, I'd go back to life. But you can find people who talk of being at a river and should they cross it or go back. Or you can find people who will talk about a bridge or a force field. It's the same experience, but it gets reported with 100 different metaphors, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they have to be metaphors, right? They have to be metaphor. I remember one about a guy in a plane and he just couldn't get to the right place. So again, the world is mysterious. I can't figure it out. And of course, if there's a transcendent world, I know even less. But there's one page in the book where I put a bunch of these accounts together and I just say, I think they're talking about the same thing, but they're all using different images for it. So what does that tell you is going on? So I do think that in addition to my optimistic pluralism, you have to pay attention to the relativity of perception. People have noticed things, for example, like Westerners will sometimes talk about going down a tunnel of light, but people from cultures that don't have tunnels, they don't have train tunnels and car tunnels and that kind, they don't use the word tunnel or an equivalent. So we're somehow giving and taking at the same time.
Right.
So what we come up with is part projection, part imagination, and I think also part input from elsewhere. But the final product is this interesting combination of things. It's not just an objective, whatever that means, report.
Yeah. So I guess somebody might think, well, the fact that people say experience what they kind of expect to experience based on their religious background, they might think that's suspicious. That suggests it's just in your head. But if it's the case that, well, perception generally actually involves a lot of us constructing and adding things, and given the commonalities, you're thinking maybe that fits with a scenario where people are all experiencing the same thing, but they're kind of filling in differently in ways that they can perceive and interpret. That sort of.
Yeah, that's correct. But there's another thing, that the premise of the argument would be wrong if you said people just experience what they expect, because tons of Christian people who have near-death experiences say, that's not exactly what I was expecting, right? I was expecting Jesus to show up, and do this or do that. Again, cases of people who are not religious, and will say something like, and there are several in the book who will say, I was sure that when you die, you go out of existence, but I didn't. I went somewhere else, and now I think there's a somewhere else. That I don't think extinction is the last word. So those are also interesting when people don't report what their culture tells them to report. I give one report, I think it's from the 19th century, of this girl who is dying and she's having visions and she's reporting what she's seeing, and her family expects her to see Jesus and many mansions, and she keeps saying, no, that's not what I'm seeing. no, I'm seeing something else. And what she's seeing is not what her religious culture told her, right? So whatever the explanation for that is, she wasn't just obediently following a script or even unconsciously following a script. She was seeing what nobody in her time and place expected her to see.
Right. I guess maybe there's still a broader sense, like, atheists, like say atheists in Western society who have these experiences. My guess is that, they might see their dead loved ones or Jesus or an angel, but probably don't see Krishna, say. So maybe there's still some broader sense in which, that's not what they expected, but it's still kind of informed by cultural categories.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. Yeah. And by the way, if you couldn't put it into language if you didn't have your cultural categories, right? You would just be speechless. So of course, everybody in our culture is influenced by Christianity in one way or another. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And in general, it's not distressing to you to think that people across religious traditions are, experiencing the same reality, because you're thinking that God is active among all people in a variety of different traditions.
That's certainly my hope. Certainly my hope. Yeah, that doesn't bother me at all. Nope.
Yeah. Do you have, maybe this is a little off topic. This is just sort of my own
Oh,
curiosity.
okay.
So like, there's one form of, pluralism or maybe inclusivism that is what, say, Justin Martyr would have thought, which is
Uh-huh.
there is something special about Christianity, but like God nonetheless is active in other traditions.
Uh-huh.
Then there's the sort that you would associate maybe with John Hick, where he thinks, from within each tradition, that
Yeah.
tradition is special, but like objectively, they're kind of all, none of them
Yeah.
is more correct than any other. They're all sort of just different responses to the same thing. And that's all there is to say. Do you have?
So yes, I depends on what I'm reading and how I'm feeling and what I'm thinking. I hold both of those views alternately. But the truth is, this really is true, and it's a huge cop-out. But my son is a Christian Buddhist, or a Buddhist Christian, and he's getting a PhD in philosophy of religion. And this is one of the problems he's working on. And when he figures it out, he will give me the answer. I trust him to tell me what the answer is. I mean, one of the horrible things about, that's not the way to put it. One of the frustrating things about life is that there are too many important things to look into, right? And, if I were to do this book rightly, I should go out and get a PhD in neuroscience. And if I'm supposed to answer your question that you just gave correctly, I need a PhD in comparative religion, and I need a whole additional education to figure these things out, right? So once you get outside your area of expertise, then if you know some things, you're an amateur, but most of the stuff, you're actually not even an amateur, right? I'm sort of an amateur when it comes to other religions. I've lectured on Buddhism, and, I read Buddhist texts and blah, 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 but I'm not an expert at all. I'm an amateur, but there are other things in which I'm not even an amateur. And since I think everything ultimately is related to everything else and everything hangs together, and you can't know things in isolation, ultimately, if you want to figure out the world, you'd have to be close to omniscient. And so that's why in the afterlife, I'm going to be studying. And that's why it goes on forever, so I can keep thinking about these things.
Okay. So this will be my last question.
Okay.
So this is something I've been thinking about recently in connection to religious experiences and things like that. They can almost seem like a little random, like the pattern by which they occur is kind of hard to interpret in purposive terms. So like sometimes people have them from out of nowhere. Sometimes people really want to have them and they don't. Sometimes they're really cryptic and people have to read all this stuff into them in a way that, you might expect an agent interacting with you wouldn't be as cryptic.
Yeah.
Might there be some reason to think that suggests, oh, maybe there's some sort of natural cause as opposed to...
Oh, yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's a serious question for Christians who think too mechanically and think that they understand God. But I don't think that's is that fundamentally different than just asking why the world is the way it is, and why it's unfair, and why bad things happen to good people and good things happen to evil people and so on. I don't know. I don't see any rhyme or reason anywhere. So that would be my first response. I don't see any rhyme or reason anywhere. But here's my second reason, which is only part of an explanation, but I am thinking along these lines, although I didn't say so in the book, and I probably shouldn't do so even on a podcast. But I have had some visionary experiences. I've had some mystical raptures. I think I've seen the future on 2 occasions. I've not only had these experiences of love, but I've had these experiences of evil. Okay. So I've had a boatload of experiences. My dad came from a family that had a boatload of experiences. Okay. My wife comes from a family full of strange and weird stories. My wife also has had a couple of visions. She's known what was going to happen before it happened. She's been telepathic and so on. Okay, so here's the thing. In Celtic Christianity, there is something called a thin place. So in their belief or mythology or whatever you want to call it, there are these places where it's easier to come into contact with God or the transcendent world. Now, I don't know anything about that. I don't know anything about that. But I do think that some people are thinner than other people. All right. So to use Charles Taylor's word, some people are more porous than others. Now, the explanation for this is purely genetic. Why are some people tall and why are some people short? Okay, because they're parents, right? Okay, so all three of my children have had visions. All three of them have seen the future. All three of them have had experiences similar to those that their parents have had. Now, you could say this is culture, that just because they've heard us talk about these experiences, we've somehow helped foster these experiences in them, but I don't think so. I think all we've done is produce children that are like ourselves, and for whatever reason, we just have these things. They just happen to us, not because we're good or bad or Christian or anything. We just have these things, and they happen to our children. One of our children excessively. I mean, it's just too much. He has too many odd, weird, strange experiences. Okay, they can be overwhelming. So I think he's very thin, and I think you can be too thin and it becomes a problem. But I just think that's his nature. And being thin doesn't have anything to do with God. It just means that these whatever transcendent realities or invisible forces, whatever is out there, that is, you just run into them more because you're less attuned to this world and you're thinner or something like that. So I'm grasping for terms, but I think part of this, not the whole thing, and I certainly don't want to exclude divine activity, right? But I think that we are just different. So let me give you one sample, and then we can stop here. So I had a vision many years ago of a friend. She died in a hospital, and she appeared to me 3 days after she died, and it was a wonderful experience, however you explain it. But I'm going to assume that it was a real experience and it wasn't just my projection or imagination, that there was some input from this dead individual. Now, I shared with her husband what had happened, okay? Mm-hmm. And he was not happy because his response was, why didn't she appear to me?
Right.
Why didn't she appear to me? Okay. I didn't give him an answer, but he told me a little later that he never dreams, He never wakes up with a dream. When he goes to sleep, he's just a blank. Okay. I am not a blank. I'm awake all night long. I dream all night long. I wake up with memories of dreams. Okay. So my guess, how about this? This is talk about going out on a limb. My guess is that she went to her husband and she couldn't get through to him. And she was thinking, okay, I'll try him. And I'm just thinner. I'm just a lot thinner. So her communication came to me and not to him. I'll bet she went to him first. And it was just a brick wall. Okay. Yeah. So maybe even if that's all false, even if I just made that up, even if it's all bogus, it could stand as a sort of analogy for the way things work in the world, right? Just, we don't all have the same brains or consciousness, whatever that is. We're not all in every other way we're different, aren't we?
Yeah.
In every
Yeah.
other way, we're different. So why aren't we different in this area of religious experience? I think we are. But I would note that I suspect there's a genetic component to
Yeah.
some of it.
Yeah, so maybe the materialist would look at the randomness and say, oh, that's because some natural process is causing some misfiring. But I guess, yeah, maybe another hypothesis as well. There's something almost like a natural capacity or sensitivity to these sorts of things. And that is distributed, randomly or genetically.
That's right.
That pattern doesn't serve any purpose, but like that explains maybe why people have experiences or don't. And
and it's not fair. I wanted to be an NBA basketball player growing up. I'm 5'10". I couldn't do it. Right? It's not fair. So I have these odd experiences. Maybe some people would say, it doesn't happen to me. It's not fair. But that's just the luck of the draw, or whatever you want to call it. And if you want to include that within divine providence, okay, that's fine. I'm not going to argue with you. But it just looks to me like genetics.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming on. I've enjoyed the conversation. I think people listening will as well.
Okay.
So you have Encountering Mystery. You have what Night Comes is your main theological.
That's my book on death and what might lie beyond, and I like some of my books more than others. I really like that book. It's one of my favorite books that I wrote anyway.
Yes, and of course, quite a lot of books on the Bible and history and.
But that's its own world, and not exactly this world we've been in today.
Yes.
But anyway, I've enjoyed the conversation, and thanks so much for having me on.
Yes, thank you.